Welcome to Talk 2, in-depth interview program of Radio Merab in English. I'm Bergen. Recently, President Biden of the United States has signed an executive order regarding Ethiopia, Eritrea, Amhara, and Tigray. Many still wonder who would be affected, which agencies have been mandated, and what is expected when the mandated agencies of the United States will announce the details soon. To discuss these matters, I have invited Mulu Beyene Kidanemariam, a doctoral research in the University of Bergen. Thank you, Mulu, for your time, and welcome to Talk 2 of the Merab Radio on FM 105.8 in Oslo.
Thank you, Germay, for having me.
Yeah. Mulu, the United States had imposed sanctions before the executive order. Now there is the executive order. What is the legal nature, the purpose of this executive order issued by President Biden? And how does it differ from the previous measures taken by the United States?
Thank you. An important question to begin the discussion with, I think. Well, let's say a few things on the general legal nature of the measure taken and see how it might differ from previous actions. As you know, as listeners would know, the United States have been actively seized of the matter, mainly from the coming to office, beginning from the coming to office of the Biden administration. The one before him has been very destructive in a way of encouraging the commencement of the war. So since the Biden administration came to power, they have issued many statements of concern. They have been actively putting the agenda in the United Nations Security Council, among other things, and have also taken certain concrete measures beginning in May 2021, which began with the announcement of visa restrictions on people that are contributing to the continuity of the crisis in Tigray mainly. And then it moved on to impose a direct sanction on a particular individual, a high military officer of the state of Eritrea, General Philippos, for his particular contribution, very destructive contribution in committing atrocities in Tigray. And then this came in a way. Well, we can say that this is a lot different from the previous ones on three accounts. The first being the author, the status of the writer of this law. Well, it's coming from the President of the United States, who is the head of state and head of government, unlike previous measures that mainly came from particular ministerial or sectoral offices. And this is a new law of the United States, unlike the previous measures, which are an implementation of an existing laws. For instance, the visa restrictions was a mere implementation of the Immigration Act of the United States, Immigration and Nationality Act. The imposition of certain restrictions, certain sanctions on the Eritrean army leader was, for instance, a mere enforcement of what they call Magnitsky Act of the United States, which targets individuals having a particular role, destructive role of committing gross human rights violations. But this one is a new law coming from the highest office, executive office of the United States. The president has a discretion, a power under the Constitution to address emerging issues of concern to the United States. So this executive order that is just passed is a manifestation of how the United States sees the crisis in Tigray and beyond, and how it affects its national security. It's not merely about that the United States is not happy with what's happening in Tigray and beyond. It's an understanding, an assessment that what's unfolding in Tigray and northern Ethiopia in general poses an extraordinary threat to the United States and its foreign policy interests. So in a way, it's a response towards furthering the United States' interests as such, beyond helping civilians, Ethiopia and the population around affected by this crisis. So the authorship, the authority that office carries is one of the distinguishing marks. The other important issue to mention is the width of what can be done through this executive order. Unlike previous measures, which were very specific towards, for instance, what kind of actions can be taken, visa or blockade of property interests of a single individual. This executive order involves visa restrictions of many people, potentially many people, the blockade of property interests, including savings in banks of many individuals and entities. It affects investment by any United States citizen or entity on any of the would-be sanctioned entities or people in Ethiopia and beyond.
But
it affects
Mulu,
export. Yes.
Who can be sanctioned? I mean, we're talking about a lot of things that are mentioned in the. It's broad in words, this executive order, and there will be obviously agencies that are mandated, which will come with details. But who do you think can be sanctioned? And you have already maybe begun, but what measures are in line?
Thank you. I think this is a direct continuation of the discussion we just had. So the purpose for which this executive order was issued is basically to stop the crisis by threatening people and entities that are standing on the way of peaceful resolution, making the crisis and famine in Tigray, most importantly, continue. And therefore, this is a way of pushing the stakeholders to bring this crisis to an end. In light of this, it provides sanction measures. It provides potential sanctions on individuals and entities. So the individuals that can be sanctioned include, well, it might have to do with the kind of activities an individual is involved. For instance, it mentions a long list of prohibited acts, the involvement, directly or indirectly, of which attracts these measures. Well, people might have read, but most importantly, it has to do with instigating, furthering, supporting the continuation of the hostilities, for instance, commission of atrocities, and so forth, a long list of acts that in any individual who, one way or the other, is involved in these acts would be amongst the potential subjects of sanction. It also addresses particular leaders. So not only is an act a condition for the sanctions, but also a role one has. For instance, being a member of the armed forces involved in this conflict is by itself a sufficient ground of all parties in a way. And also being leader of these military, security, as well as entities involved in this conflict. It even extends to their children and partners, as a matter of fact. So these are the individuals that can be subjected to sanctions. But there are also entities that come within the remit of this regime, sanction regime. They include governments of 4 of them: the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government and its party, the Amhara and its armed forces, as well as what they call the TPLF. For different reasons, we can guess why that nomenclature was used. But these governments and all of their functionaries, anyone working within them, so ministries, for instance, national banks that are engaged or are facilitating the commission of the prohibited acts, the total end of which is continuing the hostilities, for instance, will be subject of this sanction. There are additional entities that can be subjected than governments and individuals. This would include political parties, other political parties that have been supporting, that are having a role, direct or indirect, in furthering these hostilities, this crisis. Or, they might act as an entity or through their members, according to the executive order. Business entities are included as well, insofar as they have an involvement directly or indirectly in doing the prohibited acts, as well as associations, which would include the media, for instance, religious institutions that have been supporting. And these acts can be committed anywhere after November 1, 2020. It goes back. So it assesses who has been doing what and assesses it in light of what the order wants to achieve, which is to push the parties towards negotiated ceasefire, to allow free aid to continue, basic services to the population. Basically, these are how the potential subjects of the sanctions are determined.
Mulu, there are many, when you just see the social media, there are many who just wonder, how is it supposed to be implemented? How?
Well, the sanctions, I think it would be, it won't be complete unless we mention what kind of sanctions are in line. What is that these sanctions might bring about? Briefly, first, the implementing institutions, the main of which is the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, in consultation with the Secretary of State and other entities, including the Homeland Security Office, have been given a discretion. So this has a very wide, it opens a very wide discretion to these offices in terms of, one, choosing the individuals or entities that can be sanctioned. And second, the kind of sanctions that these entities can take, which would include, among others, as necessary, as they see it fit to accomplish the purpose, as I tried to mention, including, for instance, the blockade of property and property interests of any of the sanctioned entities, for instance. It goes on to prohibiting U.S. citizens and entities from investing in any of these sanctioned entities, for instance. It would prohibit, for instance, it may prohibit financial institutions in the U.S. to provide loans or credits, and also facilitate, actually, foreign exchange if it involves any of the sanctioned entities or persons. This has a very wide-ranging consequence, as you can imagine. It also might go to restricting visa, expatriating people, sanctioned people from the United States, and disallowing export of properties, technologies from the United States to Ethiopia, among other things. So it really depends on how mainly the Secretary of Treasury would see like whom to sanction basically, and what kind of measures to take into account. I think in this regard, we should also mention that the executive order is not supposed to be implemented immediately. It has been explained that the administration would give the actors some days or weeks before it actually brings the full force of the executive order into operation. So what we expect is that they would closely follow developments. They would see who is doing what before naming actually the individuals and entities, as well as the corresponding sanctions that these enforcement entities will designate. Garmai.
Yeah. In this regard, now I have understood from your points that, okay, these details that we are expecting to come from these agencies, usually Secretary of Treasury, or Secretary of Home, or State, whatever. When we, Tagaru in the diaspora, have been doing a lot to influence the international community so that the international community knows about what is happening in Tigray, informing about genocide and what have you. But what can we do in this regard? Is there something that we can do regarding this executive order and the details that are going to come? What do you advise the diaspora?
Yeah. Well, I think there are many things we, the community members, as well as the government in Tigray, officials in Tigray, should do, which they have already started by welcoming the executive order. I think for us, well, firstly, I need to mention that this executive order is not all good. It's good in so long as it will help a peaceful resolution. Otherwise, but at the same time, for instance, it entails sitting with Abiy and his administration, genociders, and to discuss, negotiate on how to move forward, basically, which is not the best thing to do in a way. But still, under the circumstance, it seems that this is the best way to do for many reasons. So, in light of this comment, I would say that we should closely work with the implementing agencies. Preferably, we need to create an institutional linkage of where we can work with the enforcement agencies by, among others, providing information, well-documented evidence of anyone who might come under the jurisdiction, the application of this law, revealing, for instance, what they have been doing, the level of involvement in these hostilities, in light of what's prohibited. Basically, we need to try to help the smooth implementation of the law, because, as I said, this is the best thing we have as things stand. And we need to be careful also on how we present ourselves, I would say, especially when it comes from officials, from the government. For instance, once we have accepted from Tigray that we are ready to settle this peacefully, we cannot officially, undertake military offensives. We can defend, of course. We cannot leave the areas that we have been forced to go to, but we should restrain from saying one thing and acting otherwise. specifically in terms of how we conduct, how I mean, the things we say, we write, especially when it comes to officials and government entities. I think these are, and one thing maybe I should add is, if and when this executive order comes to force, which I think it will, movements from Ethiopia or for Ethiopian passport holders might be restricted. Because one of the implementation mechanisms that this regime puts forward is to restrict movements of potential people that might come under this law. The same is true with transfer of money to Ethiopia. Financial flows might as well face certain restrictions from the when affected from the United States, even if, of course, the reach of this law goes well beyond the United States, actually. Because it may target people and entities that one way or the other have been involved, no matter where they sit, even if the main purpose, the main target are obviously the actors, the four named actors. So these are some of the things which I feel we should be doing.
Okay, Mulu, now maybe our listeners, fellow Africans of Radio Merab would want to know what exactly the Tigray government said in reply for this executive order. What did the Tigray government say? Have you read the details?
Yes, I did. Well, they have issued a statement, an official statement from the government of Tigray, endorsing the executive order, expressing the readiness to work for its fulfillment, expressing their readiness to sit and negotiate for a, negotiated ceasefire, end of hostilities. So in a way, the Tigray government has opted to accept the offer in a way. And this is actually a continuation of the policy that has been advanced since and before the declaration of the war. Unlike what one might continuously hear from Ethiopian media officials, the regime, the Tigray government has been consistent in terms of expressing its readiness for dialogue from day one, I should mention. So they have pointed out their agreement, the Tigray's agreement on the way the Biden administration sees the situation. For instance, the executive order states that the continuation of this hostility will be against the interests of the United States. It's a danger. That it's also a danger in that it might culminate in the disintegration of Ethiopia. And they agreed. But also, most importantly, with the sanction regime, that they are ready to help investigators, which in a way is very, very constructive, I should add.
What did Abiy Ahmed's government say? I mean, what was the reaction of Abiy Ahmed's government to the executive order, so that our listeners may have understand?
Well, it appears that the Abiy Ahmed regime has expected this executive order coming. This is seen from how speedy the reaction was posted. Long statement of 3 pages, not really addressing the executive order, but in a way refusing without really addressing the content of the executive order was issued. The way they say it, the United States has a sinister objective, that this is none of their concern, that this is meant to salvage the TPLF, as they would say. And it also contains lots of conflicting messages. For instance, it deplores the United States and other parties for not criticizing the advance of what they call the TPLF forces, while at the same time rejecting any peaceful resolution, any ceasefire. They quoted, for instance, issues of colonialism. They threw issues of sovereignty, for instance, which is laughable at best, because in international law, in contemporary international law, sovereignty comes with responsibility. You have to act as a civilized state to claim the attributes of state sovereignty. While committing atrocities, you cannot say that others do not have a stake in this. But particularly to Tigray, actually, the Abiy regime has ceded sovereignty, I would say, practically ceded sovereignty over Tigray. It cannot claim sovereignty over Tigray once it has invited, once it has collaborated with a foreign force to commit atrocities of unimaginable scale, and still claim that its sovereignty, this is an internal affair that nobody should have a say on. So in a way, this is a blanket kind of rejection, lots of non-content blabber, I would say. I think much more than what the regime said, we need to inquire as to why it's acting this way. Yeah. I think for me, it's not that the Abiy regime is expecting a military win, because they have tried it many times. I think it's counting on the famine it has intentionally triggered and is already costing lives in Tigray in mass. I think the calculation appears to me that by frustrating this system, which has been the biggest reaction from the international community so far, the Abiy regime is wanting to buy weeks during which the famine in Tigray would, escalate extremely to an extreme level and cost thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people, which might ultimately, affect the struggle, they hope. I think a potential explanation is also that they know what they have been committing. And therefore negotiations would, among other things, lead to accountability. So in a way, they might be hoping, to win this one somehow, one way or the other, and get away with what they have been doing in Tigray. Otherwise, yeah, that's the general.
Okay, to just come out a bit from the executive order, I wonder, there were also this joint investigation on human rights abuses in Tigray that Michelle Bachelet spoke about recently. And, what I wonder is, would that affect the implementation of the executive order reserves? What do you think about this?
Well, it's very hard to tell in a way. They are not connected to begin with. The executive order is basically an administrative law response, a legal response of one country, the United States. But it will depend, of course, the implementation of this executive order will require lots of information as to who has done what, for instance. In that way, the outcome of the joint investigation might have a role to play in terms of feeding information into the enforcement of this executive order. It might also be connected in a very different way, as I tried to mention earlier. One of the main purposes of this regime, this sanction regime, is to threaten the forces to sit and negotiate so that this crisis would stop. And some of the potential outcomes of that settlement would be, for instance, putting in place an accountability mechanism, which the joint investigation was hoping to achieve, even if I think it has failed miserably. So yes, there could be indirect connections. Otherwise, these are different reactions coming from different parties in relation to the crisis we have in Tigray and beyond.
Mulu, Beyene, Kidanemariam, thank you again for your usual cooperation with Radio Merab. We are really grateful for that. See you maybe next time with it. Our listeners, this is Radio Merab on FM 105.8 megahertz. It was a Talk To program, in-depth interview with Mulu Kidanemariam, Mulu Beyene Kidanemariam, of the University of Bergen. Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.